The morning Myrtle Bishop walked into the town of Rock Crossing with gunpowder still black on her hands and her husband 3 days dead. She carried herself like a woman who had already decided she would not be broken, no matter what the world had left to throw at her. It was the spring of 1878, and the New Mexico Territory was a land still deciding what it wanted to be half civilization, half wilderness, and entirely unforgiving to those who showed weakness. Rock Crossing sat at the edge of the Pecos River Valley, a town of maybe 400 souls, with a saloon that did better business than the church, a mercantile store that charged too much for flour, and a circuit judge who came through only twice a year if the roads were good. The red canyon walls that gave the town its name rose to the east like the broken teeth of something enormous and ancient, and the wind that swept down from them tasted of dust and iron, which some folks said was why the people who settled there tended to be harder than most. Myrtle was 31 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned in a practical knot at the back of her neck and green eyes that had the particular quality of a river clear on the surface, but with considerable depth and current moving beneath. She stood 5 feet and 5 inches tall, which was not remarkable, but something in the way she planted her feet made her seem taller, as though she had decided the ground beneath her belonged to her and was simply waiting for the world to agree. She was not a delicate woman in the way that some men preferred their women to be delicate, but she was not hard either. She was capable, which in the territory of 1878 was worth considerably more than delicacy. She had come to town to speak her piece before the town council. Her husband, Myrtle Bishop, had died 3 days prior on the 40-acre claim they worked 6 miles north of Rock Crossing. He had died of a gunshot wound, and the man who had fired it was named Clarence Prout, who was the foreman of the largest cattle operation in the valley, the Double Diamond Ranch, owned by a man named Archibald Stokes, who had more money than anyone in 3 counties and considerably less conscience than the average rattlesnake. Stokes had been pushing at the small homesteaders along the river valley for 2 years, wanting their land and their water rights, and Myrtle Bishop had been one of the stubborn few who had refused to sell. The trouble was that Clarence Prout was claiming self-defense. He was claiming that Myrtle Bishop had come at him with a rifle and that he had fired in protection of his own life. And Archibald Stokes had 3 witnesses who were willing to swear it was so, and the county sheriff, a round-faced man named Harold Fitch, owed Stokes money and knew it. Myrtle had found her husband in the yard of their homestead with a single bullet in his chest, and his rifle still leaning against the wall of the barn 30 feet away. She had gone to him and held him, and that was how the gunpowder had come to be on her hands, from the burn marks on his shirt, from the examination she had made of the wound with her own fingers, trying to understand what had happened in the hours she had been in town buying seed grain. A close shot, close enough that the powder had scorched the fabric, not the shot of a man defending himself at a distance, the shot of an execution. She had cleaned herself as best she could at the well and ridden to the sheriff's office, and Harold Fitch had listened to her with the expression of a man who has already made up his mind and is simply waiting for the talking to stop. He had told her that Prout's account was consistent with the facts as he understood them, and that the matter was likely closed. He had told her, with a sympathy that did not reach his eyes, that she ought to think about her situation and perhaps consider the very generous offer that Mr. Stokes had made on her property, because a widow woman alone on 40 acres was a difficult circumstance. Myrtle had looked at Harold Fitch for a long moment and then said, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled, "I will be speaking to the town council." Fitch had smiled and said, "You're welcome to do that, Mrs. Bishop." He had not said it kindly. The town council of Rock Crossing met in the back room of the mercantile store on the 1st and 3rd Thursday of each month, and by a fortunate coincidence of timing, it was a Thursday. The council consisted of 5 men. Bernard Cal, who owned the mercantile and was the council chairman, Thomas Webb, the owner of the lumber mill, Preacher Josiah Holt, who represented the moral interests of the community, Perry Dawson, who ran the livery stable, and Daniel Hunter, who owned the second-largest cattle operation in the valley, the Broken Spur Ranch, a spread of some 12,000 acres that ran along the western edge of the valley where the land turned from bottomland to high mesa. Myrtle had met Daniel Hunter exactly twice in her 2 years in Reed Rock Crossing. He was a lean, sun-dark man of 34, broad in the shoulder and long in the leg, with a face that had the kind of weather to it that comes from spending more time under an open sky than under any roof. He had dark brown hair that was inclined to curl when it grew long, and gray eyes the color of morning fog over still water. He had a reputation for being fair, for being direct, and for being the one man in the valley who had not been swayed by Archibald Stokes's money or influence, perhaps because he did not particularly need either. Myrtle had not thought much about Daniel Hunter before that Thursday morning. She had been too occupied with the business of keeping her homestead running alongside Gerald and the ongoing weariness of resisting Stokes's pressure. But she had heard enough from her neighbors to know that if there was any man on that council who would listen to her without a thumb on the scale, it was likely to be him. She walked into the mercantile and was directed to the back room by Bernard Cowell's wife, who gave her a long look that was half pity and half something sharper, more like awe. Myrtle knocked once on the plank door and pushed it open without waiting. The 5 men were seated around a long table, and they all looked up at her entrance. Bernard Cowell opened his mouth with the automatic intention of telling her she could not interrupt an official proceeding, and Myrtle said, before he could get the words out, "Gentlemen, I am Myrtle Bishop, and my husband was murdered on our property 3 days ago by a man employed by Archibald Stokes, and I am asking for a fair hearing before this council before that man walks free." There was a silence in the room that had a particular quality to it, the kind of silence that comes not from having nothing to say but from the collision of several things that need saying all at once. Daniel Hunter was the first to speak. He looked at her steadily and said, "Mrs. Bishop, sit down." It was not the tone of a man dismissing her. It was the tone of a man who was paying attention, and Myrtle sat. She had brought with her the only evidence she possessed. It was not much on the face of it, the singed shirt that Gerald had been wearing when he died, the front of which bore the unmistakable pattern of close-range powder discharge around the entry wound. She laid it on the table in front of the men, smoothing it flat with fingers that she had scrubbed hard at the well but which still bore traces of dark beneath the nails. She told them what she had found. She told them about the rifle still propped against the barn wall. She told them about the 3 witnesses Stokes had put forward, and asked them to consider whether men employed by and dependent upon Archibald Stokes were likely to risk their livelihoods by contradicting his foreman. Bernard Cowell said that it was a very unfortunate situation, but that the council had no authority over criminal matters. Thomas Webb said that Sheriff Fitch had looked into it and found no cause for further action. Preacher Holt clasped his hands together and said that he would pray for her in her grief. Perry Dawson said nothing at all and looked at the table. Daniel Hunter picked up the singed shirt and examined it. He turned it over in his hands. He held the scorched portion up to the light coming through the small window. He said, "This burn pattern is consistent with a shot fired at close range. A man defending himself from another man with a rifle would not typically be close enough to produce this." He set the shirt down and looked at Myrtle. "Mrs. Bishop, I believe you." The room changed. 3 simple words, but they had the weight of declaration. Bernard Cowell said, "Daniel, now we have to be careful here. Stokes is a—" "I know what Stokes is," Daniel Hunter said, and the quietness of his voice stopped Cowell mid-sentence. "He's a man who has been buying and bullying land away from small homesteaders for 2 years, and who has now apparently graduated to something considerably worse." He turned to the other council members. "This woman is asking for a fair hearing. I am saying we give her one." I am also saying that I intend to request that the territorial marshal be contacted regarding the conduct of this investigation, because it is clear to me that the county sheriff has not pursued this with the thoroughness that the evidence warrants." The counsel argued. Myrtle watched them argue, sitting straight in her chair with her ruined hands folded on the table, and she let them talk because the talking was going somewhere. She could feel it. In the end, the vote was 3-2. Cal and Webb voted to leave the matter with the sheriff. Hunter Holt, who had apparently been moved by the sight of the shirt more than he had let on, and Dawson voted to formally request a territorial marshal's investigation. 3-2 in her favor. It was not justice. It was the beginning of the possibility of justice. But it was more than she had walked in expecting to receive, and it had come from one man who had looked at the evidence in front of him and said, plainly and without hedging, that he believed her. After the meeting, when the other council members had filed out with varying degrees of discomfort, Myrtle stood and gathered the shirt back up and turned to find that Daniel Hunter had not left with the others. He was standing near the door with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was careful and serious. "Mrs. Bishop," he said, "I want you to know that the vote of this council carries some weight, but not enough to guarantee you any particular outcome. Stokes has resources and Sheriff Fitch's cooperation. A marshal's investigation may take weeks to begin." "I know that," she said. "Where are you staying?" She looked at him. "I'm going back to my homestead." Something shifted in his expression. "That may not be wise." "If Stokes believes you're a problem to be solved." "Mr. Hunter," she said, and her voice was steady, but there was heat beneath it, the heat of someone who has already been told 3 times today what she cannot do or should not do. "I will not be driven from my own land. My husband spent 2 years building on that claim. I will not leave it because a man with more money than sense finds me inconvenient." He looked at her for a moment, then slowly he nodded. "I understand that," he said, and she had the sense that he actually did, which was not something she had expected. "Then I would ask you to accept some practical assistance if you're willing. I have 2 hands I trust absolutely. Their names are Cobb and Martinez. I would like to send them to your place for a while, not to manage it for you, just to be there." Myrtle regarded him. He was not trying to take anything from her. He was not offering help in the way that was really an offer of control. She had spent enough time in the company of men to know the difference. "For how long?" she asked. "Until the marshal arrives and the situation is resolved," he said. She thought about it. She thought about the 40 acres and the well and the 3 milk cows and the winter wheat that was just starting to come up green in the field that Gerald had plowed in March. She thought about being alone out there with Prout and Stokes, knowing she had come to the council and made trouble. "All right," she said. "I'm grateful." He settled his hat on his head. "I'll have them out to you by nightfall." He paused at the door. "And Mrs. Bishop, I'm sorry about your husband." It was simply said. No flourish, no professional sympathy. He meant it. She could tell. "Thank you, Mr. Hunter," she said. She rode back out to the homestead in the warm afternoon light, with the Red Canyon walls throwing long shadows across the trail, and she let herself feel, for the first time since finding Gerald in the yard, the particular loneliness of a woman who has lost the person she had expected to grow old beside. She let herself feel it, and then she put it away, because there was still work to do. Cobb and Martinez arrived at sundown, as promised, a lanky, freckled young man of about 23 who spoke in a soft Arkansas drawl and a compact, dark-eyed Tejano of perhaps 30 who moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been doing difficult work all his life. They were respectful. They asked where she wanted them to set up bedrolls and whether she had food enough for 3. And when she said the barn was fine and that she had beans and cornbread and they were welcome to it, they thanked her and ate without fuss and went about their business with the calm purposefulness of people who had been given good instructions by someone they trusted. That night, sitting alone in the small house she and Gerald had built from adobe brick with their own hands, Myrtle thought about Daniel Hunter and what it had cost him to vote as he had. He was not Stokes's equal in resources, but he was the second largest operation in the valley, and openly opposing Archibald Stokes was not without consequence. She wondered about him. She wondered what kind of man he was underneath the deliberate steadiness, what had brought him to New Mexico territory, whether there was a Mrs. Hunter she had never encountered. She knew from what she had heard that he had come from Texas about 5 years prior and built the Broken Spur from a smaller claim he had purchased, that he had a reputation for treating his hands fairly and his cattle carefully, and that he was not a man given to unnecessary talk. She knew that he had been involved in a boundary dispute with Stokes 2 years back over water rights, and had won it through persistence and the careful documentation of his original purchase agreement. She had not thought about a man in any particular personal way since Gerald's death, and the fact that she was doing so now, in the immediate aftermath of that death, made her feel obscurely guilty. She told herself firmly that she was not thinking about Daniel Hunter in any personal way. She was simply thinking about the situation which involved him. She was not entirely convinced by this, but it was enough to let her sleep. In the days that followed, a routine established itself. Cobb and Martinez managed the necessary work of the place, the fencing and the stock and the morning watering, with a competence that allowed Myrtle to concentrate her energy on the more pressing business of gathering what additional evidence she could, and composing a careful letter to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe. She wrote 3 drafts of that letter before she was satisfied with it, laying out the facts in plain, clear language, with the shirt's burn pattern described in detail, and the positioning of the rifle documented with measurements she had taken herself the day after the killing. She also began talking to her neighbors. There were 7 other small homesteading operations within a reasonable riding distance of her place, and most of them had felt Stokes's pressure in some form over the past 2 years. Jim Halley, who farmed 20 acres of bottomland a mile to the south, had been offered and had refused twice. The Ortega family, mother and father and 3 grown sons who ran a modest sheep operation on the slope land to the north, had been threatened more directly. Someone had cut their fence line twice and scattered their flock, though it could never be proven who had ordered it. A widow named Agnes Park, who had a small vegetable farm on the east side of the trail, had sold out the previous autumn after her barn burned. Myrtle talked to all of them. She asked what they had seen, what they had experienced, whether they would be willing to speak to a marshal when one came. The Ortegas were cautious but not unwilling. Jim Halley was angry enough to be cooperative. Agnes Park was gone, but Myrtle rode out to the ruins of the barn on her old place and looked at it for a long time. On the 6th day after the council meeting, Daniel Hunter rode out to her homestead. She was in the field when she heard his horse, checking on the winter wheat, and she straightened and pushed her hat back on her head and watched him come up the trail. He rode a tall bay horse with a white blaze and sat easy in the saddle the way men do when they have spent most of their lives horseback. He touched his hat brim when he saw her and rode over to the fence where she was standing. "Mrs. Bishop," he said. "Mr. Hunter," she said. "Is there news?" "Some." He swung down from the horse and looped the reins over the fence post and stood on the other side of it from her, which she noticed was a considerate thing to do, keeping a proper distance, not crowding her space. "I sent a telegraph to the marshal's office myself to back your letter. I've also been making inquiries among some of the other ranchers in the county. There are 3 others beyond your neighbors who have complaints about Stokes's methods. One of them lost a well. His water mysteriously went bad the day after he refused Stokes's offer. Another had cattle die from something added to their water." She felt the quiet spread of anger that had become familiar to her over the past week. "He is not a subtle man," she said. "He doesn't believe he needs to be," Daniel said. "That's the problem with men like Stokes. They accumulate enough power that they stop bothering with subtlety, and that's when they start making the kind of mistakes that bring them down. Gerald didn't want to believe it would come to what it came to," she said. "He kept thinking, if we're just reasonable, if we just explain our position clearly enough." She stopped herself. "I'm sorry," Daniel said again. He had a way of saying it that was not hollow. She looked at the wheat coming up green in the field. He planted this in March, she said. It was the last thing he planted. She was not sure why she told him that. Daniel looked at it too. It's a good stand, he said. He knew what he was doing. She appreciated that he said something plain and practical about it rather than something sentimental. It was easier to bear. They stood for a moment in the easy quiet of the field, with the spring breeze moving through the green shoots and the red canyon walls bright in the distance. And Myrtle thought that this was the first moment in 9 days that she had felt anything close to peace. "There is another thing," Daniel said. "Stokes has been telling people in town that you're unstable. That your grief has made you unreliable. He's working to preemptively discredit whatever you tell the marshal." "Of course he is," she said. "And what are people saying? Some believe him, some don't." He met her eyes. "I'm telling you so you're prepared, not so you'll lose heart." "I don't lose heart easily, Mr. Hunter," she said. "No," he said, looking at her with that careful, serious attention. "I can see that." He stayed for coffee, which she offered because it would have been impolite not to, and they sat on the bench outside the front door of the adobe house in the afternoon warmth and talked about practical matters. The wheat, the cattle market, the water rights situation along the river, the territorial government's inconsistent enforcement of homestead protections. She found that he was easy to talk to in a way that she had not anticipated. He listened when she spoke, not with the performance of patience but with genuine interest. He had opinions and he expressed them directly, but he did not run over hers. When he left, he said, "I'll be back in a few days with any news. And Mrs. Bishop," he paused, already mounted, looking down at her from the back of the bay horse, "I want you to know that what you did in that council meeting took considerable courage. Most people in your situation would have gone home and grieved and eventually sold." She looked up at him. "I am grieving," she said. "I'm just doing it at the same time as the other things." He looked at her a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Yes," he said quietly, "I can see that too." He rode back down the trail toward the broken spur, and Myrtle watched him go and then went back into the house and told herself firmly that she had more important things to occupy her mind. She was right. She did. But the firmness required a little more effort than it had a week earlier. The marshal arrived 11 days after Myrtle's hearing before the town council. His name was Frank Delgado, and he was a compact, weathered man of perhaps 45 who had been a territorial marshal for 12 years, and who wore his authority with the comfortable ease of a man who does not need to perform it. He rode in with 2 deputy marshals, installed himself at the hotel, and began methodically interviewing every relevant party. He interviewed Myrtle first, and she told him everything she had told the town council, showed him the shirt, gave him the measurements she had taken of the yard, provided the names and locations of her neighbors who could speak to Stokes's pattern of behavior. She showed him the letter she had received from Stokes's lawyer the week before Gerald's death, offering to purchase their claim for a price that was 40% below market value, and suggesting that the climate in the valley might become challenging for small operations in the coming season. Marshal Delgado read the letter and looked up at her with eyes that were professionally neutral but not unkind. "This is useful, Mrs. Bishop," he said. "I kept all the letters," she said. "Gerald thought I was too careful about such things. He was not a man for paperwork." She paused. "I'm glad I kept them." Delgado interviewed the Ortega family and Jim Halley. He interviewed the witnesses Stokes had put forward, one at a time, and whatever happened in those conversations was not witnessed by Myrtle, but she heard later from Cobb, who had a natural talent for absorbing useful information in public spaces, that at least one of the witnesses had turned noticeably pale during his session with the marshal and had subsequently been seen going to the telegraph office. Delgado interviewed Clarence Prout, who maintained his account of self-defense with the confidence of a man who believed he was protected. He interviewed Archibald Stokes, which Myrtle would have given a great deal to observe. And on the third day of the marshal's time in Redrock Crossing, he rode out to the Bishop homestead himself to examine the scene of the shooting. He paced the yard. He examined the barn wall where the rifle had been resting. He measured distances. He looked at the ground, which had dried and been somewhat disturbed by the days of traffic since, but which still told some portion of its story to a man who knew how to read it. Daniel Hunter came with him. Myrtle had not known he was coming, and when she saw him ride up alongside the marshal, she felt a complicated thing, not annoyance, but the awareness of his presence in a way that was becoming both more familiar and more troublesome to her careful management of her own feelings. He stayed back while the marshal examined the scene, not interjecting, simply being present. When the marshal came to speak to Myrtle about what he had found, Daniel stood at a respectful distance and listened. The burn pattern on the shirt combined with the position of the rifle is inconsistent with Pruitt's account, Marshal Delgado said to her. I'm not in a position to tell you what the outcome of this will be, Mrs. Bishop, because that depends on processes above my pay grade and a great many factors I cannot control. But I will tell you that I intend to send a full report to the Territorial Attorney's office and that I believe there is a case here that warrants prosecution. What about Sheriff Fitch? She asked. A careful pause. The conduct of the initial investigation is a matter I will also be addressing, he said. After the marshal rode back toward town, Daniel Hunter did not immediately follow. He dismounted and walked over to where Myrtle was standing by the fence and stood beside her in the afternoon light. How are you holding up? He asked, not as a pleasantry, as an actual question. She thought about giving him the answer she gave everyone else, the one about being fine and managing well. She was not sure why she did not. Some days are harder than others, she said. I wake up in the morning and there is a half-second before I remember, and then I remember and it is heavy. She stopped. I do not usually say that to people. I won't make you sorry you said it to me, he said. She looked at him sideways. He was looking out at the field where the winter wheat stood higher now than it had 10 days ago, moving in the breeze with a sound like very quiet conversation. My mother died when I was 20, he said, not particularly in response to anything, just as though he were thinking aloud. I remember that half-second. It lasts longer than half a second after a while, that not knowing part. It gets longer as time goes on, and eventually it becomes most of the morning and then most of the day. It takes time. She was quiet for a moment. Is that meant to be reassuring? It's meant to be honest, he said. You seem like someone who prefers honesty. I do, she said. She turned to look at him fully. Were you married, Mr. Hunter? He shook his head. No, I have managed not to talk any woman into taking that particular risk. He said it lightly, but she caught something beneath the lightness. That seems unlikely, she said before she thought about whether she should say it. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen there before, a flicker of something unguarded, quickly settled back into his customary composure. Well, he said, I've been told I'm too given to silence and not enough to compliment. There are worse things, she said. He smiled then. It was the first time she had seen him smile properly, not just the controlled, almost smile he used in public, but an actual smile that went to his eyes, and it changed his face considerably, made him look younger, warmer. She found it dangerously appealing and looked back at the wheat field to give herself something neutral to contemplate. Thank you, she said after a moment, for all of this. You didn't have to do any of it. No, he agreed, but it was the right thing. Not everyone does the right thing just because it's right, she said, especially when the right thing has a cost. My father was a man who thought that the cost was irrelevant to the decision, he said. He did not always make it work, practically speaking. But he was not wrong about the principle. He reached for the reins of his horse. I'll let you know what I hear. He rode out, and Myrtle stayed by the fence for a while longer than was necessary, and the wheat moved in the breeze, and the canyon walls turned amber and then red as the sun began to drop, and she acknowledged to herself with a kind of quiet honesty that Daniel Hunter was becoming something in her thoughts that was more than the complication of a man who had helped her. She was not sure what to do with that. She was a widow of 2 weeks. She had a murder investigation underway, and a claim to protect, and a winter wheat crop to bring in, and a life to rebuild from the pieces that remained. She had no business thinking about a rancher's gray eyes or the way he smiled when he forgot to be composed. She went inside and made supper and told herself to be sensible. She did not entirely succeed, but she tried. 2 weeks after Marshal Delgado's investigation began, Clarence Pruitt was arrested on a charge of murder in the first degree. The warrant was issued by the territorial court in Santa Fe, which had reviewed Delgado's report and the additional testimony of one of Stokes's original witnesses, who had recanted his previous account, the pale man who had visited the telegraph office. It turned out, had a conscience that had been considerably more troubled by the events than his initial cooperation with Stokes had suggested. Sheriff Harold Fitch was simultaneously informed by the marshal's office that his handling of the investigation was under review, and that he would be expected to cooperate fully with any federal proceedings. Fitch cooperated with considerable speed thereafter, being a man whose self-interest, once properly understood to point in a different direction, proved entirely redirectable. Archibald Stokes was not arrested. There was insufficient direct evidence to tie him personally to the order that had resulted in Gerald's death, and the recanting witness had seen only Pruitt's actions, not received Stokes's specific instruction. It was the particular injustice that Myrtle had known from the beginning was the most likely outcome. The man who had built the system that killed her husband would not pay in the most direct legal sense. Pruitt would face trial. Stokes would face only the somewhat reduced social standing that came from being publicly connected to a murder investigation and the formal scrutiny of the territorial attorney's office, which had also begun examining his acquisition of several of the other homesteads in the valley, some of which now appeared to have involved considerably more pressure than any legitimate business transaction should have. It was not everything, but it was considerably more than nothing. Myrtle received the news of Pruitt's arrest on a warm April morning from Marshal Delgado himself, who rode out to inform her in person. She thanked him with the gravity it deserved. After he left, she stood in the yard for a long time looking at the land around her. The wheat field, the kitchen garden Gerald had dug the border of last fall, the adobe house they had built one wall at a time, the well they had struck water in on the third try after 2 months of trying. She sat down on the ground right there in the yard, in the dirt, which was not a dignified thing to do, and she allowed herself to cry, properly and at length, in a way she had not yet permitted herself since the morning she had found him. She cried for Gerald, and for the life they had planned here, and for the unfairness of it, and for the anger and the grief and the exhaustion of the past 3 weeks, and when she was done, she felt hollowed out and also, strangely, lighter. Cobb and Martinez, to their great credit, had apparently seen her sit down and had gone immediately and decisively to the far side of the barn, where there was always some task that needed doing, and had not emerged until she stood up and went back inside. She was grateful for that. That evening, Daniel Hunter came. He had heard the news from Delgado in town and had ridden out, he said, to make sure she was all right. She brought him inside for the first time and made coffee, and they sat at the small table by the window, and the light was long and golden in the way it is in New Mexico in April, falling in slanted bars through the glass and across the wood of the table between them. "It's not enough," she said. It was not a complaint. It was simply the statement of a fact. "No," he said, "it isn't. Stokes is going to be uncomfortable for a while, and his expansion is going to slow considerably, but he is not going to face what Pruitt faces. That is unjust, and I have no way to make it otherwise." She appreciated that he did not try to soften it. "At least Pruitt will face a trial," she said. "At least Gerald's death will be called what it was." "Yes," Daniel said. "That matters." She looked at him across the table and thought about what she wanted to say, and then decided, because she was a woman who preferred honesty, to say it. "You did something very significant for me, Mr. Hunter. You stood up in that council meeting and said you believed me when it would have been easier and more comfortable not to. I have been thinking about how to thank you properly, and I have not managed to think of anything adequate." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee cup. "You don't owe me any thanks, Mrs. Bishop," he said. "You came in there with evidence and made your case clearly and asked for exactly what you were entitled to. I just happened to be the man who was paying attention." "You were the only one paying attention," she said. "That's a problem with the others, not a credit to me," he said. She looked at him. "You are remarkably determined not to accept any appreciation." The smile again. She had been waiting for it, she realized, in a very small and carefully monitored corner of herself. "My mother said much the same thing," he said. "She called it obstinate modesty." "She was right," Myrtle said. They talked for 2 hours. She was not sure afterward how they had filled 2 hours, because the conversation moved naturally from one thing to another the way good conversation does when the people having it are genuinely interested in each other's minds. From the trial to the land to the wheat to the history of how they had each come to be where they were. He had grown up in eastern Texas, the son of a cattle farmer who had eventually lost the land to a drought and a bad year and the particular cruelty of creditors. He had worked for 10 years on other men's ranches, saving, and then had come to New Mexico territory and bought the Broken Spur's original claim and spent 5 years building it into what it was. He spoke about the land with a love that was not sentimental. He knew too much about the actual difficulty of it to be sentimental, but that was real and deep. She told him about growing up in Ohio, about learning to read from her grandmother's Bible, and falling in love with books so completely that she had for a time considered becoming a school teacher. She had met Gerald Bishop at a church social when she was 22 and he was 25, and he had been charming and funny, and had talked about going west with such vivid energy that she had found herself swept up in the vision. They had come to New Mexico territory 4 years ago with everything they owned in a single wagon. "Do you regret it?" he asked, not in a leading way, just curious. "No," she said, and it was true. "I love this land, even now. I love it more than I thought I would when Gerald talked about it. It's in the bones of me now." She paused. "I don't intend to leave it." He nodded as though she had confirmed something he had already thought. "I didn't think you would," he said. It was almost full dark when he stood to go. The lamp on the table made warm circles of light, and outside the window the first stars were beginning to show over the canyon walls. He put his hat on and stood in the door for a moment, and she stood across the room from him, and there was a moment, just a moment, where neither of them said anything, and the silence had a particular quality to it, like the held breath before something. Then he said, "Good night, Mrs. Bishop," and she said, "Good night, Mr. Hunter." And the moment passed, and he went out to his horse and rode off in the dark, and Myrtle closed the door and stood behind it for a little while with her hand on the wood. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself it was proximity and gratitude and loneliness producing impressions that had no reliable foundation. She had been a widow for 3 weeks. She was still finding her footing in a life that had shifted entirely beneath her. She was also not, if she was going to be honest with herself, particularly foolish about most things. She went to bed and listened to the wind come down from the canyons and thought about gray eyes and the particular way a man sounds when he is telling the truth. Pruitt's trial was scheduled for September in the county seat at Fort Garland, and it was a matter that would occupy some portion of Myrtle's attention through the spring and summer. She would need to give testimony. She needed to be available to the territorial attorney's office as they built their case. She also needed to bring in the winter wheat and then plant summer crops and repair the south fence where the posts had begun to rot and address the situation with one of the milk cows who had developed a hitch in her gait that was concerning. She had a great deal to do, and she did it. Cobb and Martinez stayed for another 2 weeks after Pruitt's arrest, and then, with Myrtle's genuine thanks, went back to the Broken Spur. The immediate danger had passed Stokes's attention was now occupied by the territorial attorney's scrutiny of his land acquisitions, and whatever his inclinations might have been toward making further trouble for Myrtle, his lawyer had presumably advised him strongly that this was not the moment. Daniel continued to come out to the homestead, and Myrtle continued to make coffee, and the visits became a regular feature of the week in a way that neither of them seemed inclined to examine too directly. They were useful visits, in a practical sense. He was knowledgeable about farming and ranching in ways that filled gaps in what Myrtle knew from her own experience, and she was knowledgeable about administration and documentation, and the legal aspects of land ownership in ways that occasionally proved useful to him as well. They were also, increasingly, the part of Myrtle's week that she looked forward to most, which was a fact she observed about herself with the mixture of apprehension and private delight that is the particular experience of finding yourself unexpectedly happy about something. He fixed the south fence. He had not asked whether she wanted help with it, and he had not made a great production of it. He had simply arrived one Tuesday morning with the right tools and the right wood and set to work, and she had come out of the house with coffee and a second pair of hands, and they had fixed it together over the course of the morning, talking about everything, and nothing with the easy rhythm of people who have found a comfortable frequency with each other. In June, Jim Halley's wife, Rosie, organized a community supper for the neighbors along the valley, a long-standing tradition that had been disrupted by the tensions of the past year, and both Myrtle and Daniel attended. It was the first time Myrtle had been in a social gathering of any kind since Gerald's death, and the warmth of it, the familiar faces, the smell of good food, the sound of children running in the grass outside the Halley house was both welcome and occasionally, unexpectedly, sharp. She was sitting on the porch steps with a plate in her lap when Daniel came and sat beside her, not too close. There was still propriety to consider, and he was always careful of it, which she appreciated and also found in a particular personal corner of herself slightly frustrating. "How are you managing?" he asked. "It comes in waves," she said honestly. "Just when I think I have found a level surface, a wave comes. But the time between waves is getting longer," he nodded. Beside her on the steps, his shoulder was perhaps 4 inches from hers, and she was aware of it in the precise way that you are aware of something when you are trying not to be. "Can I ask you something that may be none of my business?" she said. "You can ask," he said. "Why haven't you married?" She kept her voice even and curious rather than loaded, because it was a genuine question. "You're not a difficult man to be around. You have a good operation. You are," she paused, choosing carefully, "not unpleasant to look at." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought she might have overstepped, and then he said, "I was engaged once, 6 years ago in Texas. A woman named Ellen Marsh. He paused, she was a good woman. She decided, not unreasonably, that life on a struggling cattle claim in a territory she didn't know, with a man who had more ambition than stability, was not what she wanted for herself. She married a banker in Austin. I think she made the better choice, honestly, for what she wanted." "And what you wanted?" Myrtle asked. "What I wanted was something that took me a while to be able to name clearly," he said. He was looking out at the Halley's yard, where 2 of the Ortega boys were playing a game with a rope, and his voice was reflective in a way she had not heard before. "Someone who wasn't afraid of the work. Someone who was interested in the same things I was interested in. Someone who told the truth. Someone who had enough spine to hold their own ground and enough," he paused again, "enough warmth to make all the difficulty of living in a hard country feel worthwhile." The evening light was long and amber around them. Somewhere inside the house, someone was playing a fiddle. "That's a specific list," she said. "I'm a specific man," he said, and he turned to look at her, and the look was direct and clear, and had none of the professional composure he usually kept assembled, and Myrtle felt something move through her chest that was warm and alarming and not entirely manageable. She looked back out at the yard. "Daniel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. She did not take it back. "I think you should know that I am not entirely sure what I am doing." "That makes two of us," he said quietly. The fiddle inside played something that was almost a waltz. "I am still," she began. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for anything, Myrtle. I just want you to know that I am here, as whatever you need me to be for as long as you need that, with no demands attached." She looked at him then. He was watching her with those gray eyes that always seemed to her to be looking at the actual shape of things rather than the surface of them, and she thought that she had not in her life met a man so thoroughly without guile. "That is the most frightening thing anyone has said to me in recent memory," she said. "Why?" He was genuinely curious. "Because it's unconditional," she said. "Unconditional things are terrifying. They leave you with no maneuvering room." He considered this seriously, which was one of the things she liked about him. He took what she said seriously. "I think that might be the point of them," he said. She laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one which surprised her. She had not laughed genuinely since before Gerald died, and the sound of it coming out of her own chest felt like discovering that a window she thought was sealed shut was still capable of opening. He smiled at the sound of it, that real smile that went to his eyes, and she thought privately, in the part of herself she was still managing carefully, that she was in a great deal of trouble in the best possible sense. Summer moved through the valley with the magnificent brutality of New Mexico heat, the sky a blue so intense it was almost violent, the sun hammering down on the red rock and the dry grass, the river dropping in its bed as the snowmelt from the mountains finished running, and the rains had not yet decided to begin. Myrtle worked the homestead with the practical focus of a woman who understands that the land does not pause its demands for emotional complexity, and she found that the work was good for her. She was not a woman suited to passivity. The daily requirements of the place, the stock, the garden, the fence repairs, the preservation of the previous harvest, the preparation for the next gave her something to pour herself into that was immediate and real and produced visible results. She rode into Raydrock Crossing twice a week, and she spent enough time in the company of its people to know that the community's opinion of her situation had evolved considerably from the days when Stokes was circulating stories about her instability. The testimony of the Ortegas and Jim Halley, and the documentation that Marshall Delgado had compiled, had done its work in the social fabric of the town. People who had previously been cautious now greeted her with the directness of people who have decided where they stand. Agnes Park, the widow whose barn had burned, had come back to the valley. She was staying with the Halles while she considered whether to rebuild, and she and Myrtle had formed the quick, solid friendship of two women who have faced similar difficulties and recognize each other. Agnes was the first person to say out loud what the rest of the community had been observing with interest. She said it one afternoon in July while she and Myrtle were shelling beans on Myrtle's porch, in her direct and unsentimental way. "That Hunter man is in love with you." Myrtle continued shelling beans. "We have a friendship," she said. Agnes gave her a look. Agnes was 52, had been widowed once, had survived a great deal, and had no patience for evasion. "He rides out here 3 times a week, Myrtle. He fixed your fence. He brought you hay when your supply ran short in June and wouldn't hear of being paid for it. He looks at you like you're the most interesting thing in the county, which, to be fair, you are." Myrtle set down her handful of beans. "I am 3 months a widow," she said. "I know what you are," Agnes said. "I'm not telling you to do anything about it. I'm just telling you what I observe, because I think you know it already and are pretending not to, which seems like a waste of your very considerable intelligence." Myrtle picked her beans back up. "You are an extremely inconvenient person," she said. "I have been told that before," Agnes said comfortably. After Agnes left that afternoon, Myrtle sat with herself for a while and had the direct and honest conversation with herself that Agnes had essentially demanded she have. She admitted to herself, without euphemism or management, that what she felt in the company of Daniel Hunter had grown from gratitude and intellectual appreciation into something considerably warmer and more particular. She admitted that she had thought about him far more than was strictly appropriate. She admitted that on the occasions when he arrived and she heard his horse on the trail, there was a thing that happened in her chest that was not simply the pleasure of impending good conversation. She also admitted that she was afraid. She had loved Gerald genuinely and had lost him violently and suddenly, and the arithmetic of that of building a life with someone and having it destroyed without warning was not simple to set aside. The idea of building again, of caring about someone enough to lose them, was terrifying in a way that was entirely reasonable and entirely irrelevant, she suspected, to what was actually going to happen. She was a woman who had walked into a room of hostile men with gunpowder on her hands and asked for a fair hearing. She was not, in the end, the sort of woman who turned away from things because they were frightening. She sat with all of this and let it settle, and when she went inside to make supper she felt, for the first time, a clarity about her own feelings that did not require management. The trial of Clarence Prout was held in September at the county seat. Myrtle rode there with Agnes Park and Jim Halley and two of the Ortega sons, and testified for most of an afternoon, answering the territorial attorney's questions in the same clear, measured way she had laid the case out in the council room 5 months before. She described what she had found. She described the shirt. She described the position of the rifle. She described the correspondence from Stokes's lawyer with its veiled threats. She described the burn pattern and what it indicated about the distance from which the shot had been fired. The defense attorney was a man from Albuquerque who had been well paid by Stokes and who attempted, not particularly subtly, to rattle her composure. He suggested she had been confused in her grief. He suggested the evidence was ambiguous. He suggested that a woman who had arrived after the fact could not reliably interpret a scene she had not witnessed. Myrtle looked at him across the courtroom with the particular steadiness that had become as natural to her as breathing, and said, in her clear, unhurried voice, "The shirt shows a powder burn pattern consistent with a shot fired within 3 feet of the victim. The rifle was found 30 feet away against the barn wall. I did not need to witness the shooting to understand that these two facts are irreconcilable with a claim of self-defense at rifle distance. I simply needed to observe them, which I did." The courtroom was quiet. Daniel was there. He had come for the trial, having been listed as a supporting witness regarding Stokes's pattern of behavior in the valley, and he sat 3 rows back from Myrtle in the gallery. She had seen him when she came in and he had nodded at her once, a small deliberate nod that said everything he would have said out loud if they had been alone, that he was there, that he was steady, that she had this. She had felt it and drawn on it and turned back to face the courtroom. Clarence Prout was convicted of murder in the 2nd degree and sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison at Santa Fe. It was not 1st degree. The jury had apparently found reasonable doubt about the precise nature of the planning, which was the one concession the defense had managed. But it was conviction. It was 20 years. It was Gerald Bishop's death called what it was by 12 men who had listened to the evidence and made the right decision. After the verdict was read, Myrtle sat in the courtroom for a moment after most people had filed out. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the empty bench where the judge had been, and let the enormity of it be what it was, complete, if imperfect, accomplished. The thing she had walked into that council room to set in motion had traveled its full distance. Daniel came and sat beside her in the emptying courtroom. He did not say anything. He simply sat there, and his presence was steady and warm and entirely sufficient. "It doesn't bring him back," she said. "No," he said. "But it's right," she said. "It's closer to right than it was." "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him. He was very close, as he had not often allowed himself to be in public, and his gray eyes were soft and direct, and she thought that she had been careful and appropriate and measured for long enough. "Daniel," she said. "Yes." "I would like you to come to supper tomorrow evening," she said. "Not on business, not because there is news or a practical reason, just because I would like you to come." He looked at her for a moment in which several things were understood without being said. Then he said, "I'll be there." The ride back from Fort Garland to Redrock Crossing took most of the day, and Myrtle spent it in the company of Agnes and the Hallies with a lightness in her that she had not carried in months. The trial was done. The verdict was in. She was going home to her land, which was hers, which was staying hers, and tomorrow evening the man she had been not quite admitting to herself that she loved was coming to supper. Agnes, riding alongside her through the afternoon heat, looked at her and said nothing, but the look communicated considerable satisfaction. He came the next evening as the sun was dropping behind the mesa to the west, painting the sky in those deep orange and rose colors that the New Mexico Territory specializes in, as though it has made a particular study of beautiful endings. Myrtle had cooked a proper meal, not just beans and cornbread, but a roasted chicken and sweet potatoes from the garden, and the apple preserves she had put up in August, and had set the table with the small deliberateness of a woman who has decided that some things deserve the care. He came in through the door she held open for him, and stopped when he saw the table and looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between moved and amused. "You went to some trouble," he said. "I wanted to," she said. He brought wine, which was a thing she had not expected, a bottle of good red wine from the merchant in Fort Garland, which he had apparently thought to acquire before the ride back, which made her feel a warmth that traveled from her chest outward. He set it on the table and stood back with his hat in his hands, and she took it from him and set it on the hook by the door, and they sat down. They ate and they talked, and the wine was good, and the food was good, and the lamplight was warm in the small adobe room that Myrtle had made as much her own as she could in the 2 years she had lived in it. They talked about the trial and the verdict and the faces of the jury. They talked about what would happen to the valley now that Stokes's expansion was checked and Prout was gone. They talked about the Ortegas and whether the Ortega boys might buy Agnes Park's old claim from her and expand the sheep operation. They talked about the winter coming and what Myrtle intended to plant in the spring. And then, because the evening had a quality of completion to it, of things having arrived at their right places, the talking quieted, and there was a silence that was not awkward but full. Myrtle looked at Daniel across the table in the lamplight, and she thought about everything that had happened between the morning she had walked into the council room with gunpowder on her hands and this moment, the impossible amount of life that 5 months had contained, and she felt something settle in her that was not resignation but its opposite. A decision, a recognition. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I have been careful," she said. "Careful about what I let myself feel, about what I let show. I thought it was the right thing to do. I was a widow and you had been kind to me, and I was afraid that what I felt was just gratitude in a particular dress." She stopped. "But I have been honest with myself about it, properly honest, and it isn't gratitude, Daniel. What I feel when you're in the room is," she paused, looking for the exact right words, because she was a woman who respected precision. "It is the feeling of being completely awake." The lamplight moved between them. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and it was the first time he had done so, and it was simple and undemonstrative and entirely overwhelming. "I fell in love with you," he said. In the direct, unhurried way he said things that were true. "About 4 days after you walked into that council room and laid a scorched shirt on the table and asked 5 men to look at it and think. I have been trying to be respectful of your grief and your situation ever since, and I want you to know that I have found it very difficult." She turned her hand over under his so their fingers were interlaced and said, "Good." He laughed, and then she laughed. And in the small lamplight room in the adobe house on 40 acres of New Mexico land, something that had been carefully restrained and properly managed for 5 months became simply itself, and it was good. He kissed her, leaning across the corner of the table in a way that was not particularly graceful and also entirely perfect, and she kissed him back with the whole of her considerable self. And outside the window the October stars over the canyon walls were the particular brilliant white of high desert altitude, and the wind that came down from the mesas was cold and clean. That winter was the best winter Myrtle had spent in the territory, Not because it was easy, because it was not. The cold was serious, and the work was constant, and the distances between everything remained as they always had been. But it was warm in a way that the cold could not reach. Daniel did not move to the homestead. Propriety was still a real consideration in Redrock Crossing in 1878, and Myrtle respected it even when she found it occasionally tedious. But he was there often enough that the pattern of her days had reorganized itself around his presence without either of them having made any particular plan about it. In December, he asked her to marry him. He did it practically, which was the only way he knew how to do things that mattered to him, which she had come to understand was his particular way of being sincere. They were riding along the river on a cold, clear afternoon when the cottonwoods were bare and the water was low and silver between the banks, and he said, without preamble, "Myrtle, I would like to marry you if you're willing. I would like to live in the same house and work the same land and argue about the same fence lines and grow old in the same territory, and not spend any more time on the practical management of being in love with you from a carefully maintained, respectful distance." She had been looking at the river when he spoke, and she looked at him instead, and his expression was the expression of a man who has said the true thing and is waiting to learn what the world does with it. "Yes," she said, "I am entirely willing." He let out a breath that suggested he had been holding it for a while. "Good," he said, and then he smiled, that real smile that she had been accumulating like a particular kind of wealth, and he reached over from his horse to take her hand, and they rode back along the river in the December cold, with their hands clasped between their horses in a way that was somewhat impractical and entirely necessary. They were married in February of 1879, in the church in Redrock Crossing by Preacher Holt, who had apparently been fully converted to the cause of Myrtle's general welfare by the sight of that scorched shirt, and who conducted the ceremony with the warmth of a man marrying people he genuinely believed ought to be married. Agnes Park stood with Myrtle, and Cobb and Martinez, who had been invited as the first representatives of Daniel's household, sat in the front row looking scrubbed and pleased with themselves. The Ortegas came and filled an entire pew, and Jim and Rosie Halley were there, and a good portion of Redrock Crossing's 400 souls turned out for it, because it was February and there was not much else going on, and also because people genuinely liked what the story meant. A woman who had asked for a fair hearing and gotten one, and the man who had believed her becoming the man she chose. Myrtle wore her good dark blue dress and Gerald's pocket watch, which she had transferred to her coat pocket, because it seemed right to carry him there without making him the center of a day that was about something new. When Preacher Holt asked Daniel if he would take this woman, Daniel said, "Without hesitation and for as long as I live," which was not the standard phrasing but was sufficiently sincere that Holt did not correct it. When he asked Myrtle, she said, "With all that I am," and meant every word. He kissed her in front of the assembled population of Redrock Crossing, and she felt the warmth of it travel from her mouth to her fingertips, and it was the beginning of what she understood was going to be a very full life. The question of the homestead had been discussed carefully and at length in the months of their courtship, because it was important to Myrtle, and she wanted it understood. The 40 acres was hers. Gerald had worked it, and she had worked it, and she intended to keep working it. She did not want it absorbed into the Broken Spur. She did not want it managed by someone else or folded into a larger operation that would make her 40 acres invisible. Daniel had listened to all of this with the attentiveness he brought to everything she said, and then had proposed a solution that was both practically sensible and emotionally generous. They would run the homestead as a separate unit from the Broken Spur, with its own accounting, its own crop decisions made by Myrtle, its contribution to the household economy tracked separately so she always knew exactly what it produced and what it required. The Broken Spur's additional resources could be brought to bear when needed extra hands at harvest, equipment that a 40-acre operation couldn't justify owning, but as a service that was tracked and compensated, not as charity or absorption. "I want you to always know what yours is," he said, "and to never feel it disappearing into something larger." She had loved him for many things, but for this perhaps most precisely. They settled into a life at the Broken Spur's main house, a larger and more solid structure than the adobe homestead, though Myrtle thought the homestead had a particular beauty the bigger house lacked, and the homestead continued to run under Myrtle's management with hired help and Daniel's assistance at the labor-intensive times of year. She rode out to it every few days regardless of the weather, because the land was hers, and she had learned that land of yours has to be looked at regularly. Archibald Stokes, facing the continued scrutiny of the territorial attorney's office and the loss of the expansion he had planned, eventually sold the Double Diamond and moved to Colorado. Myrtle heard about it one afternoon in town and stood in the middle of the mercantile, and felt the particular satisfaction of an injustice that has not been fully resolved, but has been at least partially answered. He had not faced legal consequences in the way she had hoped, but he had left. The valley was different without him in it. Harold Fitch was removed as county sheriff in the spring of 1879, following the formal review of his handling of the Bishop investigation. A new sheriff was appointed, a man named Beaumont who had no prior connection to Stokes, and who ran his office with a straightforwardness that the valley's residents found refreshing. Myrtle made a point of calling on him formally at his office and introducing herself, because she believed that civic relationships required maintenance, and also because she wanted him to know that she was the sort of person who paid attention. The valley settled into a different shape. The Ortega family bought Agnes Park's old claim, as Myrtle and Daniel had predicted, and began expanding their sheep operation across both parcels. Jim and Rosie Halley drilled a second well and planted an orchard. Agnes Park, having declined to rebuild on her own land, moved into a room above the mercantile and opened a small school, because it turned out she had been a school teacher before she married and the skills had not left her. Reedrock Crossing acquired, in the person of Agnes Park, the educational institution it had long needed. The first year of Myrtle and Daniel's marriage was one of considerable learning, not because they were incompatible, but because two people who have each lived entirely self-sufficiently for a number of years have to do the real work of becoming a household together. They had different ideas about where things belonged in a kitchen. They had different ideas about when a piece of equipment needed replacing versus when it could be reasonably repaired. They had different ideas about how early to get up, with Daniel being aggressively morning-oriented and Myrtle requiring coffee before she was willing to commit to the day. They argued about these things in the productive way of two people who respect each other enough to be honest about disagreement, and who have enough foundation to weather the particular tensions of shared life without either one diminishing. There were moments of genuine friction. There always are, between people who both have strong opinions, and there were evenings where the friction had to be worked through before the warmth could return. And Myrtle found that what she valued in those moments was that Daniel never walked away from the difficulty. He was always willing to sit down and talk it through, to listen to her position, to say clearly when he thought she was wrong, and to acknowledge when she convinced him otherwise. She had not known before that this was what she needed from a partner. She knew now. In the spring of 1880, Myrtle found that she was expecting their first child. She told Daniel on a Sunday morning while they were having coffee on the porch of the Broken Spur house, with the spring flowers beginning to show in the grass along the fence, and the canyon walls red and warm in the morning light. She told him simply, watching his face, wanting to see the moment of it. His face did something extraordinary. All the composure and the deliberateness went entirely away, and what was underneath it was just pure, unguarded joy, the expression of a man who has been given something he did not know how completely he wanted until it arrived. He said, "Are you sure?" And then, immediately, "Of course you're sure that was a stupid question." She laughed. "I am sure," she said. He took her hand and held it and said nothing for a long moment, just looking out at the spring morning with the expression of a man revising upward his understanding of what his life is. "Are you well?" he asked finally. "Are you?" "I'm healthy and sensible and not prone to drama," she said. "I'll be fine." "You'll see the doctor in Fort Garland," he said. "Daniel, please," he said, which he knew was the better approach. "Yes, all right," she said. "I'll see the doctor." The pregnancy proceeded in the manner of a healthy woman in reasonable circumstances. Not without difficulty, because pregnancy never is entirely without it, but without crisis. She continued to ride out to the homestead through the spring and early summer, somewhat more carefully than usual, and continued to manage its operations. She refused to be treated as though gestation were an illness, which was a position she communicated to Daniel with enough clarity that he adjusted his anxiety into more practically useful channels, making sure she had good food and adequate rest, and was not required to lift anything genuinely heavy. He was, in the way of things, considerably more anxious about it than she was. She found this endearing mostly. Their son was born in November of 1880, in the Broken Spur house, attended by the doctor from Fort Garland, who had made the trip, and Agnes Park, who had arrived 2 days prior with the serene practicality of a woman who has seen most things, and is prepared for all of them. He came into the world in the early morning hours, with the particular energy of someone who has decided to do everything at once, and he was healthy and round and furious about the cold in the way that newborns are. Daniel was in the room, which was not the custom but which Myrtle had simply indicated she wanted, and the look on his face when the doctor placed the boy in his arms was, she thought, possibly the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. This steady, composed man, with all his careful deliberateness, utterly undone by a 7-pound person who had been in the world for approximately 4 minutes. They named him Gerald Daniel Hunter, Gerald for the man who had planted the wheat that was still growing on the homestead 40 acres to the south, Daniel for the man holding him in the gray November morning light. Both names earned, both names true. Gerald Daniel was a vigorous and opinionated infant who grew into a vigorous and opinionated toddler with auburn hair from his mother and gray eyes from his father, and a personality that combined the best and most challenging qualities of both of them. He was curious about everything and afraid of almost nothing, and had strong feelings about his breakfast and the arrangement of his blankets, and whether he was being taken seriously, which last item he clearly considered a matter of the first importance. Agnes Park, who had become essentially family in the manner of some friendships, observed him at 18 months old and said, "He is going to be an interesting person to know." "He is already an interesting person to know," Myrtle said. "He is going to cause you considerable trouble," Agnes said, with satisfaction. "He already does that too," Daniel said, and his voice had the particular warmth of a man talking about something he is unreservedly happy about. The homestead on the 40 acres north of Reedrock Crossing continued to be what Myrtle had insisted it remain hers, managed by her, productive in its own right. The winter wheat that Gerald Bishop had planted in the last March of his life had seeded itself through several seasons now, and the field it occupied had been expanded, and was part of a rotation that Myrtle had designed herself based on reading she had done and conversations with farmers in the valley. The house still stood, the well still ran, and she went to it several times a week, and sometimes just stood in the yard and felt the weight and the continuity of it. She did not carry Gerald Bishop's absence like a wound anymore. She carried it like a scar-healed tissue that was still there, still real, that ached occasionally in particular weather, but that was simply part of the landscape of herself. She had loved him and mourned him and built something new that honored both the loss and the continuing obligation to be alive and to live fully. She believed he would have approved. He had been at the core of him, a person who valued continuation. In the summer of 1882, she found herself pregnant again. She told Daniel in the same way, on the same porch, with the morning light coming off the canyon walls. He had slightly less of the stunned expression this time and considerably more of the pure warmth, and he said, "Good," with such complete sincerity that she laughed. Their daughter arrived in February of 1883, small and fierce and immediately definite about her own preferences. They named her Agnes Hunter because Myrtle had always loved the name, and because it suited the bright-eyed, determined person who had apparently already decided who she was. Agnes for the woman who was present again for the birth, and who received the honor with the matter-of-fact graciousness of someone who expects to be underestimated and is never surprised when she isn't. Gerald Daniel, by now 2 years old and deeply interested in his own status, examined his sister with the seriousness of a small scientist and announced that she was acceptable. This was considered high praise. The valley in those years was changing. The railroad had come to the edge of the county, making Fort Garland more accessible and bringing both the benefits of easier commerce and the complications that followed new populations. Red Rock Crossing was growing, new families arriving, a second church established, the mercantile expanded to meet demand, a telegraph office that now stayed busy most of the day. The wildness of it was not entirely tamed. It never would be entirely tamed. The land itself resisted that, but the particular precariousness of the early years, the sense of civilization as something held together with wire and determination against the weight of an indifferent landscape, was giving way to something more settled. Daniel served a second term on the town council and pushed through improvements to the road between Red Rock Crossing and Fort Garland that had been needed for years. Myrtle was asked to serve on the school board, which Agnes had organized into a functioning institution now, and she did so with the same organized thoroughness she brought to everything, becoming known among the other board members as the person who read all the documents before the meeting and arrived with specific questions. On a September afternoon in 1883, Myrtle rode out to the homestead alone, as she often did when she needed to think. Gerald Daniel was with Daniel at the Broken Spurs South pasture, learning to ride in the careful way his father was teaching him, patient and thorough, and with an emphasis on the horse's perspective, which Myrtle thought was a fine approach. Agnes was at the Broken Spur house with the woman who helped with the children when both parents were occupied, a steady young widow named Clara from town. Myrtle stood in the yard of the homestead in the September light, which in New Mexico has a particular quality, not the harsh brilliance of summer but something softer and more deliberate, as though the sun has decided to be thoughtful rather than insistent. The canyon walls to the east were the particular deep red of afternoon, and the wheat field was golden with the harvest coming, and the well was still good and the house was still sound. She thought about the morning 5 years ago when she had walked into town with gunpowder on her hands. She thought about what she had been then, grieving and angry and determined and afraid, though she had not let herself be afraid on the outside because there was no room for it. She thought about the council room and the 5 men, and the shirt she had laid on the table, and the vote that had gone 3-2 in her favor. She thought about a man with gray eyes who had picked up the shirt and held it to the light and said, simply and without hedging, that he believed her. She thought about everything that had followed from that, the marshal, the trial, the verdict, the justice that had been imperfect but real, the friendship that had become love, the love that had become a life that was richer than anything she had planned when she came west as a young woman in a wagon full of hope and Gerald Bishop's particular optimistic energy. She heard hooves on the trail and turned, and it was Daniel, which did not surprise her. He often knew where she was without being told, and he sometimes came when she was here alone, not because he worried about her but because this place mattered to her and that made it matter to him. He rode up and swung down and looped the reins over the fence and came to stand beside her in the yard in the September light. He looked at the wheat field and then at her, and he said nothing for a moment. She said, "I was thinking about the beginning of things." "Good thoughts or complicated ones?" he asked. "Both," she said. Mostly good. She looked at the canyon walls. I am glad I came in that day. I am glad I did not go home and grieve quietly and sell the land. So am I, he said. Not lightly. With the weight of a man who has thought about what his life would look like if certain things had gone differently and is grateful they did not. She took his hand. They stood in the yard of the Bishop homestead in the September afternoon, with the wheat going gold around them and the canyon walls running their ancient colors in the declining light, and the life they had built together, the children and the land, and the years of work and argument and warmth, and the particular daily pleasure of being understood, was all around them like weather, like something you live inside of without always noticing you are living inside of it until you stop and pay attention. Daniel, she said. Yes. You should know, she said, that I think I got the better end of this arrangement considerably. He looked at her sideways with that expression that was both serious and warm. Then you're not accounting for my side of the ledger correctly, he said. She smiled. Perhaps we're both right. That seems like the most likely explanation, he said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they stood there for a while longer, looking at the land that was hers, that was theirs, that had been fought for and held, that bore the weight of everything they had come from and everything they had built, and the living proof, in the form of two small specific children and a wheat field and a working well and a community that was something real. That justice and love and stubbornness in the right proportions can make a life that is worth having even in the hardest of countries. The afternoon light stretched long and golden over the red rock and the green gold wheat, and the two of them standing in the yard, and the wind that came down from the canyons was clean and cool and smelled of the coming autumn, and everything that had needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that had needed to be built had been built, and the life ahead of them was long and full and entirely, completely theirs.